Welcome back to We Do the Heavy Lifting, and I'm your host, Dr. Jenna Yentis, and today we do sports ecology. Our expert today is Dr. Jessica Murfree. She is a visiting professor from Texas A&M. She's traveled all over the country, and she's worked on all sorts of research about the effects of climate on sports. You've looked at climate and extreme weather, environmental justice in sport. She also was named Forbes 30 Under 30 for sport. Woo! Very excited about that. So, Dr. Murfree, give us a few examples of how climate change is affecting sport.
Sure. I think a great way to look at it is by examining the ways that we observe or engage in sport. So by watching it, by playing it, or by consuming it in other means. And so we can point to different ways that climate is affecting or is otherwise harmful to sport on all of those fronts. The big examples are really with the most recent Winter Olympic Games, which sort of broke record as being the first games on entirely artificial snow, when really all of the games, or not all of the games leading up were at least some percentage of artificial snow. There was a 96% artificial snow and then a 98% artificial snow. So when we finally hit 100%, and of course that was that made headlines, it really wasn't a huge jump from the previous Winter Games.
I see. So there's just a slow change, and it's not until we hit these critical points that it becomes news.
Right. It wasn't news at 96%.
So that's how it's affecting mainly maybe how a sport is played on artificial snow.
Right.
How is it, you said consuming a sport, and I think interacting, I can't remember all the
things.
And
participating in it. Yeah. So by consuming sport, we are altering the ways that we enjoy sporting events. A personal example, growing up as a kid, we always went to Major League Baseball games as a family. That was like the summer outing. It always overlapped with my dad's birthday. And it was this big memory of the summer. And a huge part of that memory is summer nights with fireworks and clear skies and open air, and peanut shells and all the other things that come with consuming Major League Baseball. But now more and more Major League Baseball stadiums are domed. They have roofs built on top of them, which changes that experience as a spectator. But we are making these adaptations to climate in the sport industry so that we can continue to have the games. From minor inconveniences like rain delays all the way to holistically altered schedules because of major weather events or other climate catastrophes like wildfire smoke that persists in the atmosphere for periods of time after the fire is put out.
So then you also mentioned participating in sports. So how is climate change affecting individual athletes?
Yeah, that's another spectrum, because from kids who are going out on a field or a track or a pool or a court to play for the very first time, all the way up to athletes that are competing at the highest level, are still affected by climate. And those effects are all going to be different, and there's a whole host of socio-demographic factors that would play into that as well, like resources and money. But at the smaller stage, for kids who are playing sports, the changes in climate are affecting their ability to adapt and adjust and their opportunities to play. So the more climate catastrophes we have, or the more climate hazards, means there's reduced opportunities to play sports. And then that ties into some of my justice-based work, where we can see differences in opportunity and access based on haves and have-nots. Kids who come from families that are more socioeconomically well off will remain opportunistic for those chances to compete. They'll have more resources to be able to travel in the event climate makes it difficult to play closer to home. They'll have more resources to compete after there's destruction or damage related to climate and extreme weather, whereas kids, young adults, even college students that don't, they're going to suffer the consequences a lot longer. And those disparities cross the globe, they cross country. It's not a North American thing by any means. At the highest level, we're seeing even elite athletes who have all the time and the resources to be able to compete are struggling to adapt to climate change. It becomes headline news when major sporting events come back around, because that's when we're paying attention to it the most. There are elite soccer players collapsing on fields. There are Olympians who are suffering to breathe regularly or to regulate their heart rate because there's either drastic changes in temperature, there's, effects from the heat that are beyond temperature alone. So humidity, direct sunlight, hydration, nutrition, all these other things that sort of compound the harmful effects of the environment. And then from a resources standpoint, it's just costing more and more to travel in order to reach the places where sport can be played in natural environments. So like a professional snowboarder, for example, will have to spend more to travel higher up a mountain to reach where the snow is and then adjust their body to an environment that has less breathable air.
So I have a bit of maybe a philosophical question for you, which is, you've presented all these things that are very well founded, and you may have, I guess, the naysayers that will say, why do we care that this is happening? Why, sport is just, it's not critical. It's not sleep, nutrition, it's not these things that make our lives. So why is it that, how do we get the masses to, I guess, invest in, what's happening?
Yeah, I think the critical piece in all of this for me is that sport is the tool. It's the vehicle that we can use to explain the science. And so you're right, it's not eating, sleeping, breathing, or for most people, the source of income. For a lot of people it is, though. But if we talk about the effects of climate or extreme weather on sleep, eating, providing for our families, that conversation becomes a lot more challenging, because now we're talking about biodiversity loss and agriculture and things that are not going to break news in the same way that sport does. The cool thing about sport is that it has this massive global platform. More people are paying attention to sport than politics and other forms of entertainment. So this is how we communicate the science, through sport. And we can provide these examples on sport in ways that are personally relevant to people when we think about physical activity and health and recreation, and outcomes of that. So your physical and mental well-being, and how that's so closely tied to opportunities to play sport, and even if it's not for competition, if it's just recreational or just fun or as a hobby, we can still talk about it in the same ways that makes sense to people, and then hopefully that inspires climate action across other sectors or other segments of our lives.
I think that's really interesting. And I think back to, I believe you got an award last year for a paper that you did with another faculty member on contracts. And so thinking that through, I don't know if you want give the audience a little bit about what that was. And then I was thinking how that translates to not just sport contracts, but outside of that as well.
Absolutely. It's funny because that it's kind of full circle in that way, because the idea for that project sort of was birthed outside of the sport industry. It came from a meme, actually. So for background on this project,
doesn't everything like come from a meme?
Yeah, including research. Like it started off as a joke, which is really cool. But the paper examines college football game contracts. So I did this alongside former faculty member of mine at the University of Louisville, Professor Anita Mormon, and by trade she is a lawyer. So we put our brains together and we started digging into the occurrences of extreme weather and the impacts on college sport. Paying attention to college football was really key because it is so visible on college landscapes. It's a huge piece in the financial institution for a university, for athletic programs, and it has so many people involved, and the geographic footprint of college football is massive. So we pinpointed this sport And we were looking at Division I universities, and we just started watching the news. And around the time, sort of back to school, August, September-ish, more and more things started popping up on Twitter and on the news about hurricanes. And the meme I was referencing pointed at the state of Florida and how whichever hurricane was coming at the time, there's been so many, so I couldn't even name it by name at this point. People were having hurricane parties, and the grocery stores in the bakery section had hurricane party cakes that were already decorated. You could pick it up so that when you if you're not evacuating, if you're battening down the hatches, you can have your hurricane party with your hurricane cake. And I thought this was so funny that we're making light out of very serious situations, but that's so critical with things like social justice issues and climate. It's that we're living in a world that's operating, and as human beings, we look to make the best out of situations, even when we know that there could potentially be loss and destruction. So this is all happening in August, September. Of course, college football is kicking back off, which we're really excited about. But in paying attention to the news, there were game after game after game, and we tracked this by week of the season, that were altered due to hurricanes. And by hurricanes, I mean specifically Atlantic Ocean hurricanes. We could talk about typhoons and tsunamis, but that's not going to happen in the United States, at least right now. So we started tracking this, and they just kept happening. And games were postponed, they were canceled, they were relocated. And then in digging into the law and the contracts, there was a lot of money on the line based on something as simple as a delay, all the way to a full game cancellation. And college football games are governed based on these game contracts that are signed between the universities. The general counsel, the athletic directors, and the entire athletic department, they're usually pretty privy to the nature of these contracts, and they have all these provisions that govern interests and parties in the game, all the way down to how many complimentary tickets the marching band is going to get. But the big price tags in these contracts include damages if a game isn't played, if there's some sort of breach of this contract, as well as a dollar amount for the guarantee. So if my school agrees to play your school, then we shake hands with a guarantee. This is how much money we're willing to exchange for the opportunity to play this football game. And usually these are two-way streets. Teams compete against each other repeatedly or fairly regularly. But when we started getting into cancellations and postponements, that dollar amount came into question. And then schools interpreted the languages of the contracts differently, and that led to a lot of litigation, which is even more costly, over the terms of cancellation. Is a hurricane an unforeseen circumstance? Is it inclement weather when we can see it coming? They're fairly slow-moving storms that we track for days at a time on the news. Who's at fault here? Are we prioritizing our team and student-athlete health? Or are we trying to compete this game because there's upwards of $1 million on the line? So a lot of disputes there led us to determine that the scientific knowledge that we have on the severity of climate change and extreme weather and other environmental hazards really wasn't reflected in these game contracts that could save universities tens of thousands, if not more, in money and in heartache and time.
Absolutely. I remember there was one that was canceled, maybe it was this past year, where Florida had to not travel someplace because they were locked down or they evacuated for hurricane. And then the other school was like, well, you didn't play, so you need to pay us. And they're like, but we were evacuated.
That was Miami and Arkansas State. That was kind of the straw that broke the camel and sort of busted the whole issue wide open. Miami was like, hey, this hurricane's coming. We got to get out of here. The rest of our community's getting out of here. We're like, forget football in the grand scheme of things. We're caring about our people and our safety. And Arkansas State was like, there's no hurricane here, so you can just evacuate here and play the game.
I mean, I see it from both sides, but yeah, you need that in your contract when that's going to happen just to protect everybody. Yeah. I understand.
They ended up settling that one out of court.
Yeah, well, aren't they always? Probably not.
Undisclosed dollar amount.
So what are the steps in general that sports need to be taking to think about sustainability, to think about their athletes, that sort of thing?
Yeah. What's really cool is that there is a huge blossoming of environmental sustainability in sport right now. Part of that is because it's become such a hot topic across society in general. And that's the thing about the sport industry. It's very, oftentimes very reactive to things. So once people express a public interest in something, well, now we're hopping on board, which is cool because now the message gets across, but it might mean that we're sacrificing some of the efforts that need more genuine approach or more science behind it. But the more people are talking about it, the more people are engaging in it is still a positive step forward. So we're seeing a lot of movement in the sport industry through energy use and energy consumption. There's a lot of movement in food and water waste and sourcing. So if you go to a sporting event now, there's more effort being placed on locally sourced food options, which is really exciting. Sport organizations are being more conscious of their travel, their footprint, and their carbon emissions, because we have to reckon with the global nature of sport means a lot of travel for a lot of people all the time. So these movements are really positive. The organizations are engaging with consumers. So a lot of retailers are foregoing plastic bags in their stores. They're switching materials in apparel and sneakers and other forms of equipment, which is exciting. We're moving away from single-use plastic at venues. There are ways to incentivize fans and consumers to recycle and to compost, and all of these things are major steps in the right direction. The problem is that as long as sport remains an industry, a business, the capitalist nature is always going to underscore it.
Of course.
We're always going to be talking about dollars. And even in talking about our game contracts, the momentum behind that project was there's a lot of money on the line. And as long as we're focused on money, I don't know that the sport industry could be 100% sustainable, because at the end of the day, we need to return a profit. We need to make sure the best athletes get compensated for their talent. And that's taken over in places where sport used to simply be about health and physical activity. So to move the needle past what I think is the boundary or the limit is going to have to be a return to that, a return to play, a return to recreation for elite athletes and stay-at-home spectators alike. And that's drastic.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I think we can change what it means to be normal in sport and shake up the status quo a little bit. We don't have to always have major sporting events the same time every 4 years or every year in the case of the Super Bowl or the World Series. We can get comfortable with a little bit of uncomfort in switching up our momentum or slowing down a little bit or reducing capacity or reducing travel distances for the sake of the environment if we want sport to persist long into the future.
Yeah, I know there was recently a call for F1 to think a little bit more about how they're planning their races instead of traveling. I think this year they have to go from Middle East to Australia to the U.S. back, and they're kind of all over. And I think a lot of people called for them to reconsider and think about it.
Yeah.
You know, how are they planning out races just to lower that carbon footprint? So
Right.
I think there's that idea that's permeating, but you're right. It's a business.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's more important? And I think there are ways to prioritize equitable access to sport, even in the case of F1. If we are hosting these sporting events in places that might not have otherwise gotten this visibility, well, those might not be the places that have the amount of capital to incentivize an organization like F1 to choose it as a location. But it would be an interesting opportunity. But what's more important, right?
Yeah.
This global footprint, making money, making sport equitable for all. We got to pick one, maybe pick two.
I think even something as simple as, for the Super Bowl, you have to print both teams being winners on T-shirts and hats and everything else.
Confetti.
And then where does that waste go and what are we doing? Just even simple things like that. Just being uncomfortable with the fact that maybe you can't get the T-shirt until the next day.
Yeah.
And not 30 seconds after the game
right.
ends. Yeah.
So what could we do instead? Like instead of the immediate T-shirt and hat celebration, what kind of swap could we make that is more environmentally and economically sustainable?
Yeah.
And those are the things that I would call the industry to think through.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really interesting conversation. I've learned so much.
Yay.
We always ask our guests if they have a take-home that they'd like to leave for the listeners.
Ooh.
I know. It always puts everybody on the spot and they have to think.
Well, I have so many take-homes.
Pick your top 3.
Okay. Top 3 is to think about what we do every day when we engage in sport. Just pay attention to it because I think we take a lot of that for granted. If we're watching it on TV, what kind of commercials we're paying attention to, what we're buying tickets to, where we like to sit in a stadium. Just pay attention to how you engage in sport would be the first one. The second one would be to pay attention to how the environment affects your life. If today is particularly sunny and the temperature is nice and that makes you feel excited or you make an effort to spend more time outside, think about how that makes you feel or why you're connected to nature and to the environment in that way. And then finally, I would encourage all people to then keep that memory of the environment in front of mind when you engage in sport and move this from something that we've taken for granted for so long to something that we're paying attention to.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us today. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us for another edition of We Do the Heavy Lifting. As always, if there is a topic that you'd like to hear about or questions or comments, please email us at huffines@tamu.edu. And with that, we will catch you next time. Thank you.
Ooh.
Always the fist bump.